What are the effects of excessive drinking during pregnancy? Campaigners are calling for more research into fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, a condition that affects the development of the brain. Have a look at this.
And for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and it is a form of brain damage caused by birth mother drinking through pregnancy.
Andy Jackson and his adopted sister Rachel both have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. They were taken into care as children. Both had mothers who drank heavily during pregnancy.
I was 6 years old when I was first diagnosed with FASD.
Could you run me through some of the issues that you have in relation to your condition?
One thing that really affected me was with my joints, moving them and walking long distances. I'm ADHD, the list goes on basically.
At 4 feet 7 inches, Rachel, who's now 16, stopped growing when she was 10. FASD can cause a range of developmental problems, both mental and physical.
My memory is very bad, so simple things take me a while to do. So when I was younger, I had really bad issues with like cleaning my teeth because the memory just wasn't there. So, not so much now because I've got over them, but social aspects of being in big crowds and that sort of thing used to panic me. And
you also had a lot of physical consequences as well, didn't you? Can you tell me about that?
As I grew into an adult, my bottom jaw grew normally into adult's jaw, but my top jaw stayed as like a child's jaw. 17, 18, I then had operation where they broke my jaw and then realigned it. And
you're the two smallest in the family and you give us the most problems.
Sharon and her husband Paul have adopted 5 children and fostered many more. It's thought levels of FASD may be much higher amongst children taken into care.
Right, watch out!
My first placement was Andy and his brother Eddie. Andy already came to me with a diagnosis of FAS, but you know, we didn't know anything about it. Social services never mentioned it again. And about 4 years later, I just happened to be watching the breakfast TV, and there was a lady on there just talking about FASD, and then I punched Paul and said that's what they said that Andy had.
Sharon's since become a campaigner and is convinced there are many children who remain undiagnosed.
We need to be helping these children get a diagnosis and getting the help and support that they need to stop all the secondary conditions like the mental health issues, because there's no reason for these children to have the mental health issues. Yes, it's permanent brain damage, but it's not a life sentence. You know, if you get the right support, you can have a lovely, fulfilled life.
How do you feel when you think about your biological mum drinking when she was pregnant with you?
I'm in this situation having to struggle with day-to-day normal life, that thing, and knowing that it was preventable. It's kind of annoying at heart, but then sometimes it thinks I don't know the situation that she was in or the background from her, so it's kind of not like I sympathise for her, because
I think I have a mixture of emotions. Frustration is one of them, sadness and kind of understanding, because she might have not known. Like, I had to live with that every day, knowing that I'm different because one person made a mistake.
Elizabeth Glinker reporting there. New research published today by the universities of Bristol and Cardiff actually is part of the first UK attempt to estimate the number of children affected by conditions which could be linked to FASD. We can talk to Dr Raja Mukherjee. He was part of the research that's been done, and you're the NHS consultant running the UK's only FASD clinic. It concludes the research, Dr Mukherjee, that up to 17% of children in the sample had symptoms which could be consistent with FASD. Many people will think that number sounds extraordinarily high.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for inviting me. It does sound high, and I think I was a little bit surprised when it first came out, but then more as I thought about it, when you bear in mind that over 70% of that population had drunk at some level during the pregnancy, so your risk factor is in the 70%, it then starts to be less surprising the number that we've found. And that is only an estimate because it's between 6 and 17%. So we don't really know where in that range it is because it's a screening population. It was trying to get an estimate because funding to get a proper study where we go and look for it properly and do the research hasn't been available. So that was a struggle. And this is a way that Cheryl Maguire, who was the lead author on the project, found as part of her PhD to go and look into this and get an estimate, which we just simply didn't have in the UK before this.
Right, but there are limitations, aren't there, to the research that's been done? As you say, it's quite difficult to diagnose. Some of those children, would you accept, could have been suffering from something else, or something else could have caused it?
Yeah, I think we tried our best based on what was in the database to try and exclude that as far as possible. So everybody who met these criteria had to have had some exposure to alcohol. So nobody who didn't have an exposure to alcohol was ruled out. Then you tried to rule out genetic factors, and there were things in the database of that, so that was ruled out. So you do your best, accepting that it's not going to be the same as a full clinical evaluation. In clinic, we do spend nearly 15 to 20 hours per person as a specialist clinic to try and do a comprehensive review. You couldn't do that with a database, but there were areas in that where you could try and get as close to it as possible, which is why it's a screening population and as robust as we can get it. So yes, there are limitations, but it's as good as we've got in the UK so far.
Right. I mean, nearly 1 in 5 mothers in the study whose children showed symptoms of FASD reported not drinking during their pregnancy. And obviously you've got to take that at face value. So how instructive are the results?
The results give us an indication towards what the level might be. Even if you take the lower end estimate of 6%, that's a lot of people. And at the moment, there are no services for this at all. You know, people fall between massive gaps and they just don't get seen. The level of knowledge that exists around the country for this is very limited. We've shown that. It's a real postcode lottery as to whether anybody can get any access at all. Over half the people referred to our service are not funded, so therefore don't get seen. And so there are problems with this, and this starts to raise the awareness for people to say it's something we need to do something about. There are moves afoot to try and look at this, but you know, unless we know how common it is, that debate's always going to be out there. So yes, it's a high figure. It may or may not be accurate, but it does show that we need to look into this and we can't ignore it.
So what more can you do to diagnose FASD?
In what way do you mind asking?
I mean, are there other ways of diagnosing it? I mean, we obviously saw in that film some of the things that are used in terms of sort of characteristics, and we saw the foster mother there saying, as soon as she heard the list of symptoms and the diagnosis, she knew that was what was wrong with the person she was looking after.
Sure. Yeah, so the diagnosis has to be something where you rule in factors as much as possible, but also rule out. So a lot of the time we spend in the clinic here is to try and do as much investigation so we can rule out other causes, because we know what other causes can do. But that can take time sometimes.
All right.
You know, go on, sorry.
I was just going to open it up to the panel slightly more broadly on guidance on drinking during pregnancy, because this has always been a controversial, contentious issue. Do you think there needs to be more guidance about it, Claire?
I just think there needs to be firm guidance. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that women were advised that they could have a small glass of wine a week, and now I think the advice is not to have any at all. But it seems like there's a lot of conflicting advice out there, and I think a strong message is what's needed. I just want to say that I think this is great that research is finally being done into this. It's for far too long been a hidden problem in our society. But I want to urge caution. I mean, Dr. Mukherjee there saying that 70% of women in the study had drunk during pregnancy, and there was one of the newspapers reported today that 3/4 of women in this country drink during pregnancy, which makes us sound absolutely awful, doesn't it? But what you've got to remember is that only, I think it's 50% of pregnancies in this country are not formally planned. So I suspect a huge chunk of that is women who don't know they're pregnant drinking in the first trimester.
And that's an issue, isn't it? Women do drink early on if they don't know they're pregnant. Is there a danger of shaming women in this debate?
Yeah, I think that there is, and I think as we've heard, there needs to be more research done into this, right? So we need to be making our decisions upon good research base that we can make informed decisions off of. But I think there is a risk of kind of going around and picking out particular women as being problematic because they've drunk in their pregnancy. Do they know? Do they know the guidelines? How clear are the guidelines? What is the information that is being given out through the NHS? And so how informed are women? And I think that is incredibly important.
There's also a risk of making women feel incredibly anxious, women who might be pregnant now or who are planning a family. You know, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service have said they're worried that women could go and have terminations based on research that perhaps isn't clear-cut.
Right. I mean, a zero tolerance towards alcohol during pregnancy, Matt? I mean, is that the way forward?
I think zero tolerance on alcohol, not just in pregnancy, but in many walks of life. I think with driving and things like that, the only safe amount is none when it comes to operating things. And if you're carrying a child, I mean, I don't want to judge people because I'm never going to have to carry a child, and I like a drink, and I don't have any idea what it's like to make the sacrifice of being a mother. So I don't want to sit here and condemn people, but it strikes me that if there's going to be a health consequence, then don't do it.
I think the first thing you've got to do is you've got to root it actually in the evidence. I think it's always very easy to say, well, the simplest is completely forbid or completely stigmatised. You've actually got to root it in the real evidence. We know, unfortunately, there are some parts of public health advice in recent years that have basically been a bit made up. For example, the number of units that say for almost 20 years, this country had a number that was members of the committee who made it sat around the room and said, actually, we don't have a good evidence base, we're going to guess. I also think we're talking at the start of the show about stigma, and the main tool that's been used to persuade women not to drink in pregnancy has been stigma. But you also see, I think, the after effects of that once somebody is born, if they are potentially affected by a condition like this. The negative knock-on effect of that, maybe well-intentioned stigma, could also be to encourage people's parents not to seek help for them as children. And that would be a bad thing.
Well, and one of the interesting points, Dr. Mukherjee, you're still with us, is that Claire raised this issue of not wanting to cause panic or making pregnant mothers anxious. I mean, are we talking about FASD as a result of very heavy drinking in pregnancy?
So there's a few of your panel members have talked about the science. You know, the science basically, as over the last 10 years, has continued to show that we can identify risk levels, we can't identify individual harm. So if you drink heavily, the risk of having an FASD outcome is very high. Now, this study showed that some people had reported low-level exposure and met the diagnostic criteria or the thresholds in the screen. And so therefore, it's suggesting some people who think they're drinking low levels are having affected potentially children. And so it comes back to the whole thing about levels of risk. So because we can't identify an individual woman's individual risk level, that's one of the main reasons why we say avoid it. Now, that doesn't mean that just because you've had the odd glass now and again, that you will definitely have a damaged child. And I completely agree. We shouldn't be causing stigma. We shouldn't be blaming women. We've got other research that we've published to say that that's a bad thing. And really, what we're trying to do is give people information so they can make informed decisions. And that's hopefully what this does.
All right, just very briefly, how does the UK compare to other countries around the world in terms of advice about drinking alcohol during pregnancy and the prevalence of FASD?
Oh, we were way behind. In terms of America and the States and Canada, Australia had changed their guidance at least 10 years before we did. I wrote a paper in 2005 suggesting that we should change it. It took 10 years before the advice to catch up to that. When I completed my PhD, one of the questions saying is, why is the UK so far behind us and the rest of the world at changing its guidance? We have now caught up with the rest of the world rather than the rest of the world thinking we're being out of step.
All right. Dr. Mukherjee, thank you very much for joining us.